There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. With us from New York is John Sitilides. He's a global risk analyst and a consultant to the U.S. State Department. Afshin Molavi is a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins University Foreign Policy Institute right here in Washington, D.C. And Qinduo Xu is a senior researcher with the Pangoal Institution in Beijing. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Qinduo, let me start with you. So President Trump is acting on these tariffs. China has retaliated. In fact, a spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry said that President Trump has ignited a trade war. How serious has this got now?
Well, I think from Beijing, there's a sense of confusion and frustration. You know, there has been like 3 rounds of negotiation, and there are some progress, obviously. At least one report indicating that China is going to purchase as much as like 70 billion worth of U.S. goods in order to reduce the trade deficit. But as all this is going on, President Trump announced basically a trade war with China. So China is forced to fight back, and there's no other choice.
And Qinduo, the Chinese position has been all along that if these tariffs are imposed, then all the other agreements, all the other discussions we had before this are off the table.
Yes, that's true. That's part of the response. One part of that is like, China will respond with the same value and also the same intensity in terms of the tariffs, in terms of the value of the goods of the U.S. Imported from the U.S. At the same time, China says all the negotiations and all the outcomes result out of those negotiations will be off the table, will be void. So basically now we are, going back to square zero, basically. So, a lot of challenges for the two countries. We will see.
Afshin, the United States, President Trump in particular, has complained about the trade deficit with China. But if you look at these tariffs that the United States is imposing on Chinese imports, they specifically target Chinese technology, including the Made in China 2025 technology innovation program that the Chinese have implemented. What's going on here?
You raise a good point here, Anand, because Trump administration officials have pointed to those industries, and they've basically said in no uncertain terms that they don't want China to dominate in those high-tech industries of the future. And their argument is that China's state capitalist model will help them dominate these industries of the future. My response to that is, we're the United States of America. We've got some of the most innovative, dynamic companies anywhere on Earth. American companies can certainly compete on their own without protection from the Trump administration. And frankly, those technology companies don't even want that protection because China is such an important market for them. Right. China has become the demand engine for so many things. We talk about China as the demand engine for soybeans and agricultural goods and crude oil, but it's a demand engine for iPhones and a lot of technology products as well. The Chinese middle class are major buyers of U.S. technology company goods.
The other complaint from the United States, Afshin, is that those Chinese subsidies have brought prices down radically, causing dumping.
Right. Yeah.
Is that a valid complaint?
Well, on that one there could be some valid complaints, but there's dumping going on all the time. Yeah. All across the global economy, there is dumping going on all the time. So these are the 2 largest economies in the world, and Anand, this is happening at precisely the wrong time. Remember at the beginning of the year, the world was saying that we're seeing synchronized global growth, and the Eurozone was growing, the U.S. was growing, China was growing. Well, the Eurozone is faltering now. China is still growing, the U.S. is still growing. These are the 2 largest economies in the world. These is going to have ripple effects across the global economy, not just with these 2 economies.
All right, I want to get back to that in a moment, but let me go to John Sitilides in New York. And John, the Trump administration says it wants to bring down that deficit, $375 billion trade deficit with China. And as Qinduo Xu told us earlier on, China has said that it wants to buy more American goods. Could this not have been better handled through negotiation rather than President Trump announcing tariffs?
Perhaps, but the Trump administration is, I think, bringing trade strategy into a wider array of concerns in the U.S.-China relationship. So on this in particular, first of all, I want to be very careful because some are terming it a trade war, but the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 34/100ths of 1% today in response to this back and forth between Washington and Beijing. If the market drops 1 or 2%, then I think we have something serious at hand. Right now, I think we're at the beginning of what's going to be a very long-term process, and this does involve a negotiation, and the president's been clear about that. It may not be on the terms that the Chinese find comfortable or certain, but this is going to be something that is going to be a very serious priority for the United States, and it won't be seen in isolation. It will very much be taken in the context of how China is working with the U.S. to maintain maximum pressure on North Korea to achieve denuclearization, as well as the other issue that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is discussing with the Chinese foreign minister, and that's the South China Sea.
John, domestically, how is this being handled in the United States? Because we get these reports that not everyone in the White House is on board with President Trump announcing these tariffs, that there are two factions, let's say, within the White House. There is one faction which appears to have got its argument pushed through with the announcement of these tariffs. There is another which is pushed more for negotiation. Is there a division in the White House?
There may very well be, but I think the issue here really is what is President Trump's position and who in the White House is going to be implementing his policy per his decision. We've seen this playing out in national security. There have been winners and losers. We may have this playing out in terms of economic policy and trade policy. But so far, I think even people like Larry Kudlow, who's an avowed free trader, has found a way to combine his concern for free and equitable trade within the context of the ultimate decision makers' objectives. So I think everyone is going to come on board here, and the president's going to be driving this train. Remember how important trade was in the 2015 and 2016 presidential election. It's a very high-risk strategy, and this could play up in a way that blows up in the Republicans' faces in the November elections, and even in 2020 with the Chinese targeting states that were key to President Trump's electoral victory. So there's no doubt we're in a high-stakes game here.
Shindo, if we look at the retaliation by the Chinese, $50 billion in tariffs announced by China, $34 billion will target U.S. agricultural products, automobiles, and aquatic products, as it's been put. This will hurt U.S. farmers. How does China want to implement this? Because, I mean, it would have to have alternative sources for these things, wouldn't it?
Well, for China, the easy target obviously is the farm products, in particular like soybeans, because U.S. sell half of its export to China. So China is its largest and the fastest growing market for farm products, including soybeans. And of course, this is an easy target for the Chinese government to fight back. And probably, there are people also in China says that, we have to hit it hard. Otherwise, the Trump administration probably will find it hard to understand, what's the problem with, having some trade frictions or having trade war with China. And so China is ready, has been ready for a long time. If there's, extra tariffs against the Chinese products, China is ready with its list of products targeting the American side. Of course, nobody wins from such a trade friction, trade war. Chinese companies will suffer exporting to the U.S., and the U.S. farmers and the U.S. Suppliers related to those farming products will also suffer from these tensions, currently, because these measures will be implemented very soon in early July. So, there's a strong possibility that both sides will suffer from this.
Afshin, we will see consequences, as John has pointed out as well. But, President Trump's key foreign policy and foreign trade mantra has always been America first.
That's right.
And I'm going to look after the interests of the American worker. He's always said that. My primary concern is the American worker. But if you look at these actions that he's taken, how does this put America first, and how does this protect the American worker?
Yeah, I'm not sure how it protects the American worker. I mean, look, when you look at the American worker has benefited from these basically low-cost goods that have come from places like China that you can buy in stores like Walmart and those kind of places. So they have, and when you look at manufacturing jobs, right? There have been numerous studies on this, Anand. We're losing a lot more jobs to automation than we are to trade with China here in the United States, and so those jobs are not coming back. And when you look at the number of jobs that are dependent on both foreign direct investment in the United States and exports, you're talking about 20 million jobs. This is according to the very Commerce Department. 20 million jobs directly or indirectly related to foreign direct investment or export industries. So America is actually more globalized than sometimes the president thinks it is, and it actually has benefited them more than he thinks it has.
John, Gary Cohn, the former director of the National Economic Council at the White House, he said that a trade war, if this escalates down to a full-blown trade war, will lead to higher prices for U.S. consumers, more debt, and a potential economic slowdown in the country. Is he right?
In the short term, it could be the case. But before we talk about a trade war, let's keep in mind that we're talking about a trade kerfuffle right now. And I think what's important from the president's perspective is keep in mind that the U.S. Trade Representative's Office put out a report in March of this year that faulted China for really triggering a trade war years, if not several decades ago, with forced technology transfers, with mandatory joint ventures, and what the U.S. Trade Representative's Office reported to President Trump amounting to between $200 and $600 billion a year in theft from the American economy in the form of IP and technology theft. And so I think this has been very influential in the president's thinking, and I think he's determined to risk a short-term bump in terms of the economy and the bilateral relationship for longer-term benefits for the American economy, for the American worker, and this is not just going to be China. This is also NAFTA, and this is also the European Union.
Qinduo, we've heard that very often, that accusation of Chinese intellectual property theft, Chinese technology theft from American companies. What have the Chinese been saying about these accusations?
Well, in terms of a joint venture, that's part of the technology transfer, or you can describe it as technology for market share. If you look at it today, Chinese companies' overseas investment, they are also being asked basically to share their technology with a local company in order to gain the market access in other developing countries. Unfortunately, that's the reality. And for less developed countries, there's no bargain for them. The only bargain is their own home market. So that I can open my market, can I get some of your technology because you are more developed. So that's what China has done. But now China is changing. China basically says like everybody can invest in China without any limitation, without any, you don't need any permission, for example, in the financial sector. And auto import, tariffs are being cut. And, the US companies, German companies, Japanese companies will benefit from that. China is opening further and further. For joint ventures or for basically or solely foreign investment in China, so there's no limit. China is changing. I don't think any further tariffs or further punitive measures against China will change. I don't know. It's already changing. So what's the target? What the government wants to gain from such an action? It appears to the Chinese side it's more about the political stuff here because midterm election is upcoming. So probably that's a concern.
Okay,
well, that's a consideration, let's say.
Great. Well, joining us now from Edmonton is Gordon Houlden. He's a political science professor and the director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. Gordon, thanks for joining us. Nice to have you on the show. We've been talking about these tariffs that are going to be slapped on Chinese imports into the United States. What's your view on that? Does this bring us closer to a trade war?
Well, I would agree with your other speakers. We're not yet in a trade war, but I think it certainly heightens the risk. Seen from an outside perspective, outside of those two countries, I'm concerned that these are the two largest economies on earth. China is the largest trading country by far. This sets a tone for the broader international trading system, which is highly negative. There's others involved as well, of course. Canada, the United States, Europe and the United States engaged in trade problems, tariffs and counter-tariffs potentially. I think that the tone internationally is highly negative, and I have some concerns with both countries, quite frankly. But this isn't the sort of leadership that we would like to see those of us smaller countries like Canada that live by trade.
And looking at the international impact, Gordon, the International Monetary Fund said that these US tariffs, threaten the global trading system and will damage the US economy. Do you see that happening?
Well, I think some of the commentary has been, yes, these are serious numbers, but a really tiny percentage of the overall trading relationship and of the overall US and Chinese economy. But I think there is that risk of, given that President Trump, for example, has already said that he'd double the amount of tariffs, another $100 billion of tariffs, that will surely and certainly be followed by China. There is that risk of a downward spiral. It can also contaminate broader aspects of US-China collaboration, cooperation on economic issues, and even on other issues such as North Korea. So the situation may be slightly more serious than one might think just from these initial numbers of $50 billion per side.
One other point, Gordon, and that is there are thousands of American businesses that depend on Chinese markets, that depend on Chinese investors for that matter. Even here in the United States, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is not happy with the president's actions. What kind of impact will there be on those businesses?
Well, there can be a significant input. There are many American businesses, Canadian businesses as well, that depend on reasonably priced, good quality Chinese inputs as part of their overall product. So if you then have to rely on more highly priced or find new producers of materials for your own productions, that can be disruptive. As well, quite frankly, there can be an input on American consumers who suddenly find that they have more expensive inputs. The net effect, I think, of these tariffs and counter tariffs, particularly if they should multiply, can also be quite inflationary, in that these costs will be paid by someone, probably the U.S. importer or the U.S. consumer, that can add gradually, significantly, if they increase in size, to the inflation pressures within the United States economy.
All right, John, how big a risk is that for the American consumer? I mean, it's a political risk as well, isn't it?
No, the risk is significant over the long term. And the question is going to be, how do these tactics play out in the short term? What kind of responses we'll be seeing from China in the days and weeks ahead? But the president's obviously playing a very disruptive strategy over here, and he makes no bones about it. This is who he is. This is what he said he would do. I believe he's very sincere in his belief that America has not been dealt a fair hand in global trade. And that's why I mentioned before, not just in terms of what we're talking about here in China, but also in terms of the European Union, NAFTA, and what we have is really a series of preferential trade agreements that promote free trade in a very selective way. And the president said just a few days ago, why not try to see how we get to universal free trade and end all of these selective agreements, whether it's the EU, whether it's NAFTA, whether the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and look to see how we remove as many subsidies and barriers as possible. Extraordinarily difficult, including in Washington. But I don't know to what extent this isn't an actual vision on his part.
Afshin, what do you make of that? The fact that the United States, President Trump says, the United States has not been given a fair hand, that this game is rigged.
You know, he's been saying this from the very beginning, and I just don't see it, Anand. Look, the United States is the largest economy in the world by far. We, as I said earlier, it has some of the most dynamic companies in the world. There are companies here in the United States that have market caps that would be part of the G20. They are larger than entire countries, right? And when you look at the post-World War II international architecture, it was largely written by the United States, right? And the global trading system largely written by the United States. So I don't see the world running circles around the United States. And Anand, I think someone who travels, someone who's lived outside the United States for many years, and I know the world doesn't think that they're running circles around the United States as well. When big American multinational companies come in, they know how to handle themselves in foreign markets. And so I just don't buy this argument.
Right. Qinduo, I'm wondering to what extent this could get a lot worse, because the United States also says that it will restrict certain types of Chinese investment in the United States. It will restrict the export of certain advanced technologies to China. How will China respond to that?
Well, a good point, Anand. Here's a good question here. If you look at the tariffs or the products targeted by the tariffs, it's so-called like Made in China 2025. So it goes beyond the trade deficit for whatever amount over there. It's about the competition between the two countries. If you look at the U.S., strategic papers, which view China as a strategic competitor, so not a partner. Not like a competitor and partner, no. So the relationship somehow in the U.S. strategic documents had changed in terms of the nature of the two countries. So I think here is the fundamental reason. So that's why the Chinese high-tech sector is being targeted. And I think for China, short term, yes, it will suffer. But the long term, there's a belief China will emerge in a better shape. Because China has a large market which is growing and which is predicted to overtake the United States to become the largest retail market this year. And China has a strong growth in terms of domestic consumption. And also, there's a huge investment in technology here. And for China, China would like to negotiate all the differences. China is ready to purchase more products from the United States to help reduce the trade deficit. China is even, I believe, ready to talk about like an economic structure, because that's also the concern for some Americans.
Gordon, there could be other kinds of consequences to what President Trump is doing, isn't there? I mean, nothing happens in isolation. For instance, the United States has been involved with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea on trying to persuade that country to get rid of its nuclear weapons. Clearly, he needs China's help to get that done. How is it going to help him if he targets China in this way?
My own view is that economics and trade cannot be completely divorced from politics and from the overall relationship. If we do end up in a nasty, ongoing, and intensifying trade fight, it will contaminate, or at least has the potential to seriously contaminate, the political relationship as well. You noted that America needs Chinese help on North Korea. And quite frankly, that could be said of any international crisis that may emerge, if only because China sits on the UN Security Council and because China has an increasing role globally. Any international crisis, the United States will look to China to consult and potentially for assistance in resolving that issue. So there is a knock-on effect, which could be quite serious, of what starts simply as a relatively minor trade skirmish. The consequences could be broadening and affect other sectors.
John, what's your view on that knock-on effect that Gordon was talking about a moment ago? I mean, it's not just the DPRK nuclear issue that we're talking about here. There's a whole host of other international issues, which would require cooperation between the United States and with China as well. If you look at things like terrorism, cybersecurity, climate change, they need to work with each other.
Oh, very much so. And President Trump has been very emphatic with all of these very strong statements about the U.S. position on trade. He continues to reference his very good friend, President Xi Jinping, and how they have a good relationship and they're constantly talking and the like. And it's, I think, part of the history of the Trump negotiating style that he believes worked very well for him in the private sector, and he's now applying in his relations with Congress, in his relations with different interest groups in the United States, with allies in NATO, with partners in the G7, and with countries such as China. And that's to keep the other negotiating parties off balance as much as possible. And I think that's one of the things that they're looking to do with Beijing right now. And it's not only in terms of the denuclearization of North Korea. I think the South China Sea is going to be a very important issue that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has been discussing with the Chinese foreign minister over the last 48 hours. And I think the White House is going to be looking to see whether there are other tools to try to keep the Chinese focused on achieving some of their joint aims in the Korean Peninsula, such as the possible sale of F-35s to Taiwan. So they're going to play from a hand of many different cards here.
Afshin, you were telling us earlier on about the fact that the world has seen enormous growth over the past few decades, growth worldwide, thanks to globalization, thanks to barriers being removed in many places. There has been a downside, of course. There's been an unequal distribution of wealth and income. Could that be coming to an end? I mean, the fact that we've had this spurt of growth over the last few years?
I mean, if we on a macro level, you're absolutely right. And if you look at it, from early 1990 to today, we've had, about 1 billion people lifted from extreme poverty. A lot of that has to do with China. China's lifted, anywhere from 300 to 500 million people from, poverty. All across the world, we've seen girls who have more access to education than they've ever had. Diseases that would kill you, 30, 40 years ago in parts of the developing world, you shrug off with, the right to immunization. So the world is moving in the right direction in so many ways. But you also point out that we're seeing, rising income inequality, across the world, uneven distribution. That's, and in this time which is why we are become addicted to this growth. Right. So if we don't have this growth, and you couple that with the rise in automation and the robotics, which is going to be destroying jobs in the
Right.
future. I mean, this is precisely the wrong time to be doing these kind of things. And then if you just bring it back to lastly to the U.S. economy, where you have strong consumer spending,
Right.
modest inflation, and historically low unemployment, it just doesn't seem like good timing.
Right. Qinduo, very quickly, I've got 30 seconds. So China has responded with its own tariffs, but what else can we see from China? Has China left the door of negotiation still open?
Well, I would say so. Yes, China has always preferred, the way to solve this problem is through negotiation. Through negotiation, you have give and of course take. So that's perfectly fine because trade in, one buys, one sells in itself. It's fair. If you think there's a problem, we can talk and let's solve this problem. That's basically the basic principle of the Chinese side here.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Have a great weekend, all of you. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.